November 11th, 1942. The ruins of the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. Stalingrad. Snow mixes with ash in the freezing air as Sergeant Alexei Volkov slams a heavy wrench against the frozen track pin of a T-34. The metallic clang echoes through the shattered roof of the assembly hall, momentarily drowning out the constant rattle of German MG-42 machine gun fire less than 300 yards away. His breath steams in the bitter cold, his hands raw and blackened with grease, as he desperately tries to ready the machine for a counterattack that might never come. Inside the cavernous factory, the war is not a distant concept but an immediate, suffocating reality, where workers assemble tanks under direct artillery fire. Volkov watches a welder seal, a hull plate, sparks cascading onto the concrete floor like erratic fireworks, illuminating the haggard faces of mechanics who have not slept in days. The factory floor is a graveyard of twisted metal and unpainted steel. Yet from this industrial chaotic inferno rises the Soviet Union's only hope for survival. This T-34, smelling of fresh paint and ozone, is not just a vehicle, it is a desperate prayer made of armor. Volkov climbs onto the sloped frontal armor, his boots slipping on the frost, and peers into the open driver's hatch where Private Dmitry Sokolov is cursing at the stiffness of the clutch pedal. Sokolov, a former tractor driver from the collective farms of Ukraine, looks up with eyes sunken deep into their sockets, his face a mask of soot and exhaustion. Beside the tank, the loader, a young boy named Yuri who lied about his age to enlist, struggles to lift a heavy 76mm high-explosive shell into the rack, his thin arms trembling under the weight of the ammunition that will soon determine their fate. The tank itself is a rough beast, lacking the creature comforts of Western machinery but built with a singular, brutal purpose. Its cast turret is rough to the touch, showing the hasty grind marks of production, and the wide tracks are designed to chew through the deep Russian mud that has swallowed the German Wehrmacht whole. Every bolt and weld screams of urgency. A weapon forged not for parade grounds but for the savage, close-quarters brawl that Stalingrad has become. The V2 diesel engine coughs to life, belching a thick cloud of black smoke that fills the freezing assembly hall with the acrid scent of power. A sudden mortar impact shakes the foundation of the building, sending dust and debris raining down onto the turret as the factory whistle screams a final, mournful warning. Orders are shouted over the roar of the engine, commanding Volkov and his crew to move immediately toward the contested rubble of the Spartakovka sector. The massive steel doors of the factory groan open, revealing a landscape that looks more like the surface of the moon than a city, cratered and grey under the winter sky. Volkov drops into the commander's cupola, the heavy hatch clanging shut above him, sealing them inside their steel coffin. Sokolov revs the engine, and the T-34 lurches forward with a violent jerk, the tracks grinding against the concrete before biting into the frozen earth outside. Through the narrow vision slit, the world is reduced to a grainy, shaking strip of destruction where skeletons of buildings claw at the sky. They pass infantrymen huddled in craters, wrapped in rags and clutching Mosin Nagant rifles, who look up with a mixture of envy and pity at the steel monster rumbling past them. The tank is a target, a magnet for every German anti-tank gunner hiding in the ruins. But for now, it is a moving fortress. The radio crackles with static, and the panicked voice of a platoon leader reporting enemy movement near the railway embankment ahead. Volkov traverses the turret, the electric motor whining in protest, bringing the long barrel of the main gun to bear on a pile of rubble that looks suspiciously like a fortification. Through the telescopic sight, he spots the distinct field grey uniforms of German stormtroopers moving aggressively through the debris. His heart hammers against his ribs, distinct and loud even over the engine's roar, as he realizes their journey of 2,000 kilometers begins not with a march, but with a fight for survival right here in the ashes. Inside the cramped turret, the atmosphere is thick with the smell of diesel fumes and nervous sweat as the crew prepares for their first engagement. Mikhail, the gunner who sits, squeezed between the breech of the gun and the turret wall, presses his forehead against the rubber pad of the optic. He is a man of few words, a mechanic from the Urals, who treats the cannon with a terrifying reverence, his hand hovering over the firing trigger. Volkov barks out the range and azimuth, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, guiding Mikhail's aim toward the German position. The German infantry spot the lumbering Soviet behemoth and scramble for cover. But a Pak-38 anti-tank gun hidden in a storefront reveals itself with a flash of fire. The shell ricochets off the T-34's sloped frontal armor with a deafening, bell-like clang that leaves the crew's ears ringing and hearts pounding. It is a terrifying wake-up call. A reminder of the invincibility myth that the Germans have shattered over the last year. But the T-34 was designed for exactly this punishment. Its angles calculatingly engineered to deflect death and buy the crew seconds of life. High explosive. Load Volkov screams, and Yuri slams a shell into the breach. The heavy metallic clack, signaling they are ready to answer the insult. Mikhail spins the elevation wheel, adjusting for the drop, and squeezes the trigger. The tank rocks violently backward as the 76mm gun roars, spitting a tongue of flame that illuminates the gloom of the ruined street. Downrange, the storefront explodes in a shower of brick and mortar, silencing the German gun in a cloud of dust. There is no time for celebration, only the frantic rhythm of reloading as they continue their advance. Sokolov shifts gears, pushing the tank forward over the debris, the tracks crushing the remains of the German position under tons of Soviet steel. The vibration of the hull travels up through the soles of their boots, a constant reminder of the raw mechanical power at their disposal. They are not just fighting enemy soldiers, they are fighting the landscape itself, navigating through a maze of collapsed walls and bomb craters that threaten to throw a track and leave them stranded. Every corner is a potential ambush, every shadow a possible grave. As twilight descends over the burning city, the temperature plummets further, freezing the mud on the tracks into concrete-hard chunks. The fighting slows to a sporadic exchange of tracer fire that arcs across the sky like angry hornets. Volkov orders a halt near the remnants of a workers' dormitory, the engine idling with a deep, rhythmic thrum that serves as a lullaby for the exhausted infantry digging in around them. They open the hatches to vent the fumes, the rush of cold air biting their faces, tasting of smoke and cordite. Night in Stalingrad brings a different kind of terror, where the silence is more unnerving than the noise of battle. The Luftwaffe, dominant by day, recedes, leaving the sky to the Soviet night witches flying their biplanes on harassment raids. Volkov sits on the turret roof, wrapped in his sheepskin coat, watching the flares drift slowly down over the Volga River behind them. The river is their lifeline, the only connection to the rest of the Soviet Union, and it is choked with ice and under constant artillery bombardment. The crew shares a meager meal of hardtack and frozen fatback, passing a canteen of vodka silently between them to ward off the chill. They do not speak of the grand strategy or the generals in Moscow. Their world has shrunk to the interior of the tank and the few hundred meters of sightline around them. Yet, there is a shift in the air, a whisper traveling through the lines that fresh divisions are gathering on the flanks. They do not know it yet. But Operation Uranus is being prepared, a massive pincer movement designed to encircle the German Sixth Army. For now, they are simply survivors in the meat grinder, men who have merged with their machine to become an instrument of war. The T-34 cools in the night air, the metal ticking as it contracts, a living thing resting before the slaughter resumes at dawn. Volkov looks to the west, toward the darkness where the heart of the German Reich lies thousands of kilometers away. The road to Berlin is paved with blood and ice, and tonight, under the burning skyline of Stalingrad, they have taken their very first step. July 12th, 1943. The scorched steppe near Prokhorovka station. The brutal Russian winter has been replaced by a suffocating summer heat that turns the interior of the tank into a roasting oven. Sergeant Alexei Volkov wipes sweat from his eyes, the salt stinging his vision, as he stares across the swaying golden wheat fields. The air shimmers with heat haze, distorting the horizon where dark, geometric shapes are beginning to emerge like beetles crawling from the earth. The silence of the morning is heavy, pressed down by the humidity, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant, ominous rumble of a gathering storm that has nothing to do with the weather. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, the temperature has already climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, soaking the crew's uniforms in sweat that smells of fear and diesel oil. Private Sokolov grips the steering levers with hands that leave wet prints on the steel, his eyes fixed on the narrow vision slit that offers his only view of the world. Yuri, the young loader, is shirtless now, his chest heaving as he arranges the ammunition racks, ensuring the armor-piercing rounds are within easy reach. They are no longer the green recruits of Stalingrad, they are survivors, hardened by months of retreat and defense. But nothing has prepared them for the scale of what is about to happen. Volkov presses his headset tight against his ears as the radio network comes alive with a cacophony of Russian voices, a chaotic symphony of orders and coordinates. The Red Army has amassed a reserve force of steel previously unseen in human history, hiding in the gullies and tree lines, waiting to spring the trap on the German pincers. But the Germans have brought their own monsters to the field. The new Tiger and Panther tanks, heavy beasts with thick armor and high-velocity guns that can kill a T-34 from 2 kilometers away. The Soviet advantage is speed and numbers, and the strategy is suicidal, but necessary. They must charge directly into the guns. A red flare arcs high into the dusty sky, signaling the start of the counterattack, and the ground begins to tremble violently. Sokolov stomps on the accelerator, and the tank surges forward, joining hundreds of others in a massive steel wave crashing through the wheat fields. The engine roars, straining against the weight, as the T-34 gathers speed, its tracks kicking up a cloud of dust that instantly chokes the air and reduces visibility to near zero. They are racing toward death, attempting to close the distance before the superior German optics and firepower can pick them off one by one in the open killing ground. Through the sights, Volkov sees the first flashes of the German gun line. Distinct sparkles on the horizon followed instantly by the supersonic crack of armor-piercing shells. To his left, a T-34 from the 2nd Battalion erupts into a ball of orange flame, its turret blown high into the air by the impact of an 88mm round. There is no time to mourn or even process the loss. They drive through the smoke of their burning comrades, the debris clattering against their own hull. The order is to close with the enemy, to get inside their guard, where the heavy German guns cannot track the faster Soviet tanks. The distance closes rapidly, the engagement shifting from a long-range duel to a chaotic, point-blank brawl among the ravines and railway embankments. Sokolov maneuvers the tank violently, zigzagging to throw off the aim of the German gunners, his movements instinctual and sharp. Volkov spots a Panzer IV turning to engage them, its boxy silhouette distinct against the dark earth, and screams a target designation to Mikhail. The turret traverses with an agonizing slowness, or so it feels, as Mikhail aligns the crosshairs on the flat vertical plate of the enemy tank. Fire, Volkov shouts, the command lost in the thunder of the discharge as the 76mm gun recoils, filling the turret with acrid cordite smoke. The shell strikes true, punching through the German armor and igniting the ammunition stored inside, sending a jet of fire shooting out of the commander's hatch. But there is no respite. A massive Tiger tank looms out of the dust cloud ahead, a terrifying fortress of steel that seems impervious to their weapons. Its turret rotates toward them with mechanical menace, the long barrel of its main gun looking like a tunnel into the afterlife. Sokolov screams a curse and slams the left steering lever back, spinning the T-34 into a sharp turn just as the Tiger fires. The high-velocity shell screams past their turret, the shockwave rattling their teeth and knocking loose equipment from the interior walls. They are too close for the Tiger to adjust quickly, its heavy turret traversing too slowly to keep up with the nimble Soviet machine. Volkov realizes their only chance is to flank the beast, to hit it in the thinner side armor or the rear engine deck where it is vulnerable. "Drive! Get behind him!" faster, Volkov yells, kicking the back of Sokolov's seat to urge him on. The T-34 roars, its engines screaming at maximum RPMs as they circle the lumbering giant, mud and dirt spraying from their tracks. The German commander realizes the danger and tries to pivot his entire tank, the tracks grinding the earth. But the T-34 is already slipping into his blind spot. It is a dance of death, a contest between agility and brute force played out at a range of less than 50 meters. Mikhail fights to keep the gun steady as they bounce over the uneven terrain, his eye glued to the optic, waiting for the perfect angle. Yuri slams another shell into the breach, his hands slippery with sweat. bruising his knuckles against the steel ring of the turret. They drift past the side of the Tiger, revealing the flat armor plate between the tracks and the upper hull. Mikhail does not wait for the command. He squeezes the trigger the moment the crosshair settles on the German cross painted on the side. The impact is deafening, a sledgehammer blow that shakes the ground as the shell penetrates the Tiger's engine compartment. Black smoke erupts from the rear of the German tank, followed by tongues of oily flame that lick up the sides of the turret. The beast shudders and stops, its tracks going slack as the internal fire spreads to the fuel tanks. The crew inside the T-34 lets out a collective breath, a mixture of triumph and sheer terror. But the battle is far from over. All around them, the steppe is burning. The field at Prokhorovka has become a graveyard of armor, a surreal landscape of twisted metal and charred bodies where friend and foe are intermingled. The sky is dark at noon, blotted out by the thick columns of smoke rising from hundreds of burning tanks. The air is so thick with dust and soot that the sun appears as a dim, blood-red disk, casting a hellish glow over the slaughter. The radio is a stream of panicked reports and desperate calls for support, indicating that the melee has dissolved into hundreds of individual duels. As the afternoon wears on, the physical toll on the crew becomes excruciating. They are dehydrated, deafened, and exhausted to the point of collapse. The fumes from the gun and the engine are slowly poisoning them, making their heads spin and their limbs feel heavy as lead. Yet they fight on, driven by a primal instinct to survive and a hatred fueled by the devastation of their homeland. They engage infantry in trenches, crushing machine gun nests under their tracks, and trade fire with German assault guns hidden in the tree lines. Near the railway embankment, they witness a scene of ultimate desperation, a T-34, its main gun disabled, ramming a Tiger at full speed. The collision sounds like a train wreck, the screech of tearing metal echoing across the valley as the two tanks become locked together in a fatal embrace. The Soviet crew bails out, submachine guns in hand, engaging the German crew in hand-to-hand combat amidst the burning wreckage. It is total war, stripped of any chivalry or distance, reduced to men killing each other with whatever is at hand. By evening, the intensity of the battle begins to wane, the German offensive momentum broken against the wall of Soviet steel and resolve. The Tigers and Panthers, for all their technical superiority, have been swarmed and blunted by the sheer tenacity of the Red Army. Volkov orders the tank into a hull-down position behind a burning farmhouse, the engine finally falling silent as the fuel gauge hovers near empty. They open the hatches, gasping for fresh air, but the air outside is just as foul, smelling of burning rubber and roasted flesh. Volkov climbs out onto the turret roof, his legs trembling as the adrenaline crash hits him, and looks out over the battlefield. It is a scene of apocalyptic destruction, stretching for miles in every direction, dotted with the glowing carcasses of machines that were once the pride of nations. The German advance, the great Operation Citadel, has been halted here in the black earth of Russia. They have survived the fire, but they are changed men, their souls scoured by the ferocity of the collision. The crew gathers on the engine deck, sharing a canteen of warm water, their faces blackened masks with only the whites of their eyes visible. They do not speak of victory, for the cost has been too high. But there is a grim understanding that the tide has turned. The Wehrmacht has thrown its best against them and failed to break through. From here, the road leads only one way west. The journey to Berlin continues, but now they are the ones who will be doing the pushing. June 22nd, 1944. The Pripyat Marshes, Belarusia. 3 years to the day since the Germans invaded, and the air hangs heavy with a humid, suffocating silence in the vast swamplands. Sergeant Alexei Volkov swats a cloud of mosquitoes from his neck, his uniform clinging to his skin in the damp heat, as he stands in the open hatch of a newly issued T-34-85. The tank is draped in moss and branches, a metal beast hiding in the primordial slime, invisible to the Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes buzzing high overhead. Around them, thousands of engines sit silent and cold, a massive coil of steel waiting to spring, hidden by the greatest deception campaign in military history. The preparations for Operation Bagration have been a masterclass in maskirovka, or military deception. designed to convince the German High Command that the blow will fall in the south. In Ukraine, Volkov watches the sun dip below the tree line, knowing that miles of wooden causeways, corduroy roads made of felled logs, have been secretly laid through the impassable bogs by combat engineers working silently at night. The crew is tense, not with the terror of Stalingrad, but with the coiled energy of a predator about to ambush its prey. They are no longer the desperate defenders of the motherland. They are the tip of a spear aimed directly at the heart of Army Group Center. At 0400 hours, the silence is shattered not by a whistle, but by the apocalyptic roar of thousands of artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers firing in unison. The sound is a physical force, a tearing of the sky that vibrates through the hull of the tank and rattles the teeth of the crew. Volkov watches through his binoculars as the German horizon simply disintegrates, the enemy trench lines vanishing under a wall of fire and earth. The Stalin's organs scream overhead, leaving trails of smoke as they deliver a barrage so intense that it reportedly drives surviving German defenders insane before they even see a Soviet soldier. Driver, forward, follow the logs, Volkov commands, his voice steady over the intercom as the artillery lifts to strike targets deeper in the rear. Sokolov eases the clutch, and the T-34 85 lurches onto the submerged log road, the tracks churning brown water as they navigate the swamp. To the left and right, tanks that slip off the path instantly sink to their fenders in the sucking mud, their crews scrambling to attach tow cables. It is a precarious tightrope walk performed by 40-ton machines, a gamble that relies on speed and the audacity to attack where the terrain itself says it is impossible. They burst from the tree line and onto firm ground, catching the German defenders completely unaware and still reeling from the bombardment. The landscape is a moonscape of craters and shattered bunkers, populated by dazed Wehrmacht soldiers who are surrendering in droves or fleeing in panic. This is deep battle doctrine in action. The objective is not just to break the line, but to drive deep into the enemy rear, severing supply lines and command centers. The T-34 does not stop to mop up infantry. It roars past them, leaving the cleanup to the rifle divisions following in their wake. By midday, the heat inside the tank is sweltering, mixed with the smell of propellant and the new, distinct scent of the 85mm shells. The upgraded main gun is a revelation for Mikhail, offering a lethal punch that can penetrate the frontal armor of German heavy tanks at combat ranges. They encounter a retreating column of Opel Blitz trucks and half-tracks clogging a narrow dirt road, a scene of utter chaos as the German logistical tail collapses. Volkov orders high-explosive fire, and Mikhail methodically destroys the lead and rear vehicles, trapping the convoy in a burning kill zone. Overhead, the sky belongs to the Red Air Force, a stark contrast to the early days of the war when the Luftwaffe reigned supreme. Flights of Il-2 Sturmoviks, heavily armored ground attack aircraft known as flying tanks, swoop down like hawks, their cannons tearing through the trapped German column. The crew watches with grim satisfaction as the Sturmoviks unleash rockets that turn the road into an inferno of twisted metal and horse-drawn carts. The tables have turned completely. The hunters of 1,941 have become the hunted, scurrying for cover in the ditches as the Soviet juggernaut rolls over them. The advance is relentless, continuing through the short summer nights with the aid of searchlights bouncing off the low clouds to create artificial moonlight. Sokolov drives until his arms are numb from vibration, his eyes burning from the strain of peering through the dust-coated periscopes. They sleep in shifts of 2 hours, curled up on ammo crates or the engine deck, the vibration of the diesel motor a constant lullaby. There is no front line anymore, only a fluid, rapidly moving arrow on a map pointing west, driving deeper into occupied territory with every passing hour. As they push further into Belarus, the crew witnesses the horrific aftermath of 3 years of brutal occupation and the current German scorched earth policy. They pass through villages reduced to ash, where chimneys stand like tombstones among the charred remains of wooden cottages. In one hamlet, they find the bodies of civilians executed by retreating SS units, left by the roadside as a final act of spite. Yuri, the loader, stares at the carnage with tears streaking his soot-stained face. his grip tightening on a shell casing until his knuckles turn white. The sorrow quickly hardens into a cold, diamond-hard rage. This is no longer just a war for territory, but a crusade for retribution. Logistics, once the Achilles heel of the Red Army, now flows like a mighty river behind the armored spearheads. Hundreds of American-made Studebaker trucks follow the tank brigades, laden with fuel, ammunition, and canned meat, ensuring the offensive does not stall. The sheer industrial might of the Allies is on full display, a mechanized wave that the crumbling German industry cannot hope to match. Volkov marvels at the endless line of vehicles, realizing that they are part of a machine too big to fail, a force of nature that will stop at nothing. Near the town of Bobruisk, the trap snaps shut, encircling tens of thousands of German soldiers in a cauldron of death and despair. The T-34 sits on a ridge overlooking the Berezina River, the same river where Napoleon's army met its doom more than a century prior. The chaotic scene below is a massacre, with German units trying desperately to cross bombed-out bridges under withering Soviet artillery fire. The water runs red with blood and is choked with the wreckage of a destroyed army, a grim historical echo that signals the end of the Wehrmacht's presence in Russia. On July 3rd, the tank rolls into the outskirts of Minsk, the capital of Belarus. Amidst a scene of jubilant chaos and destruction, the city is a ruin, but the few surviving inhabitants emerge from cellars and rubble to greet their liberators with flowers and tears. Women kiss the dusty armor of the tank, pressing loaves of bread into the hands of the bewildered crew who have seen nothing but death for weeks. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated humanity in the midst of the grinder, a reminder of what they are fighting for. But the pause is brief, for the orders from Moscow are clear: there is to be no rest until the beast is slain in its lair. The destruction of Army Group Center has torn a gap hundreds of kilometers wide in the German front, a hole through which the Red Army is pouring like a flood. They have advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks, moving faster than any army in history. But the crew knows the hardest miles are still ahead. The border of the Soviet Union is approaching, and beyond it lies Poland. And then, the dark heart of the enemy itself. The crew cleans the barrel of the 85mm gun, restocks the ammunition racks, and refuels the thirsty beast under the twilight sky of a liberated Minsk. They are exhausted, their uniforms rotting off their bodies, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. But their morale is ironclad. They have survived the retreat, the defense, and now the breakthrough. Evolving into masters of their trade, Volkov looks at his map, tracing the line that leads inexorably west, and gives the order to mount up. The journey to Berlin is far from over, but for the first time, the end is visible on the horizon. August 15th, 1944. The dusty plains of central Poland, west of Lublin. The landscape has shifted dramatically from the endless, suffocating birch forests of Russia to the manicured, rolling farmland of Central Europe. Sergeant Alexei Volkov stands in the commander's hatch, his eyes scanning the horizon where the sun sets behind a quaint, red-roofed village that looks like something out of a fairy tale. Were it not for the black smoke pouring from the church steeple, the air here smells different, less of pine and swamp, and more of dry wheat, brick dust, and the unwashed bodies of thousands of men marching inexorably toward the west. The T-34, 85, now bearing the scars of a dozen engagements since the marshes of Belarus, groans under the strain of the relentless advance. Its tracks are loose, clattering loudly against the drive sprockets, and the engine consumes oil with a thirsty voracity that worries the crew. Private Sokolov fights the steering levers constantly, his forearms bulging with the effort to keep the 40-ton beast moving in a straight line on the rutted Polish roads. They are no longer a fresh unit. They are a rusted, battered assembly of steel and flesh, held together by sheer will and the momentum of victory. The resistance has stiffened significantly as they approach the Vistula River, the last major natural barrier before the German border. The disorganized retreat of Army Group Center has been replaced by desperate fear, localized counterattacks launched by ad hoc battle groups of the Wehrmacht. These are not the hollowed-out divisions of the past month, but fanatical rearguards reinforced with new equipment. Volkov warns the crew to stay sharp, knowing that a wounded animal is most dangerous when cornered. and the Nazi beast is now backed against the wall of its own homeland. Near the village of Studzianki, the column grinds to a sudden, violent halt as a high-velocity shell decapitates the lead IS-2 heavy tank, sending its massive turret tumbling into a ditch. The radio explodes with panicked reports of a new threat, King Tigers. These 68-ton monsters, with armor so thick it is virtually impervious to standard anti-tank fire, have appeared on the battlefield like vengeful ghosts. Volkov spots the ambusher low, sloping silhouette hidden in a copse of trees, its long 88mm gun tracking their movement with terrifying precision. Hard left, smoke pop, smoke, Volkov screams, dropping into the turret as Sokolov yanks the left lever, spinning the T-34 behind the burning carcass of a half-track. Mikhail fumbles with the smoke canister launcher, discharging a white phosphorus grenade that creates a blinding screen in seconds. They are outclassed in a head-on fight. The only way to survive a King Tiger is to outmaneuver it, to use their superior speed to get to the flank where the armor is thinner, but the terrain here is open, offering little cover for such a daring move. The engagement devolves into a frantic game of cat and mouse amidst the burning rye fields. Volkov directs Sokolov to use the smoke and the chaos of the artillery barrage to close the distance, moving in short, erratic bounds. The King Tiger fires again, the shell passing so close to their turret that the shockwave shatters the glass in Volkov's periscope, blinding him momentarily with shards and dust. They are fighting blind, guided only by instinct and the terrifying roar of the enemy engine that seems to vibrate in their very bones. Through a gap in the smoke, they see the German behemoth distracted by a flight of IL-2, Sturmovix strafing its position with rockets. Seizing the moment, Sokolov accelerates, driving the T-34 through a hedgerow and emerging on the King Tiger's flank. Mikhail does not wait for a perfect sight picture. He fires a high-velocity armor-piercing round into the side of the enemy turret at point-blank range. The impact cracks the German steel, followed by a secondary explosion as the ammunition inside ignites, blowing the heavy hatch open and silencing the monster. Surviving the ambush, the unit pushes forward to the banks of the Vistula River, a broad, grey expanse of water that separates them from the strategic bridgeheads. The engineers are already at work, constructing pontoon bridges under heavy mortar fire, their bodies slick with sweat and river water. The crossing is a scene of organized pandemonium, trucks, tanks, and horse-drawn artillery jostling for position on the swaying wooden planks. Volkov watches the sky anxiously, knowing the Luftwaffe concentrates its remaining strength on these fragile choke points. As the T-34 creeps onto the pontoon bridge, the structure groans and dips perilously under the weight, water lapping over the edges of the tracks. A sudden scream of engines announces the arrival of German Stuka dive bombers, plummeting from the clouds in a near-vertical dive. Bombs bracket the bridge, sending geysers of water hundreds of feet into the air and rocking the tank violently. Sokolov keeps his foot steady on the accelerator, knowing that stopping now would mean death for them and the blockade of the entire crossing. They reach the western bank and immediately fan out into the Magnusow bridgehead, a small patch of liberated ground that the Germans are determined to crush. The soil here is sandy and loose, making it difficult to dig in, but the crew works feverishly with shovels to create a hull-down position. For the next week, they exist in a state of constant vigilance, repelling wave after wave of German infantry supported by Nebelwerfer rocket artillery. The screaming Mimis howl through the night, a psychological terror weapon that denies them any restful sleep. The atmosphere in Poland is markedly different from the Soviet Union. There is a complex tension in the air. The civilians they encounter are grateful but wary, caught between two historic enemies, their eyes reflecting a history of partition and occupation. Volkov trades a tin of American Spam for a basket of fresh apples with a local farmer, but the exchange is stiff, lacking the familial warmth they experienced in Russia. They are liberators. Yes, but to the Poles. They are also a new, unknown quantity arriving with the force of a tidal wave. By late August, the offensive momentum that carried them 2,000 kilometers finally evaporates. The supply lines stretch to their absolute breaking point. The order comes down from Marshal Zhukov to halt and consolidate, a command that is met with a mixture of relief and frustration. To the northwest, The sky glows red at night from the fires of Warsaw, where the Polish Home Army has risen up against the Nazi occupiers. The crew watches the distant smoke, hearing the rumble of explosions, wondering why the Red Army does not advance to help. Unaware of the cold political calculus being made in Moscow, autumn descends rapidly, turning the Polish roads into a glutinous soup of mud that swallows trucks whole and freezes the tracks of the tanks overnight. The crew transitions into a static existence, living in a dugout beneath the tank, reinforcing their position with logs and sandbags. They receive winter uniforms, padded Telegrajka jackets and fur hats, preparing for another season of freezing warfare. The maintenance crews finally catch up, bringing spare parts, new tracks, and barrels of fresh oil to rejuvenate the tired machine. During the lull, Volkov finds time to write a letter home, his pencil hovering over the damp paper as he struggles to describe the journey. He writes not of the killing or the terror, but of the strange architecture of the Polish churches and the taste of the local apples, trying to preserve a shred of normalcy. The crew bonds tightly during these long, cold nights, playing cards by the light of a kerosene lamp, their laughter a fragile defense against the looming shadow of the final offensive. They know this pause is merely the deep breath before the plunge. The strategic map in the command bunker shows the next objective clearly, the Oder River, and beyond it, Berlin. The distance is shorter now, less than 600 kilometers, but every meter will be contested by a fanatical enemy defending their own soil. The German propaganda broadcasts, which they occasionally pick up on the radio, speak of wonder weapons and a final victory. But the crew only sees the reality of a broken Bronne. Desperate army. They clean their weapons, check the sights, and wait for the frost to harden the ground enough for the tracks to grip. As the first snows of 1945 begin to fall, covering the scarred Vistula bridgehead in a blanket of white, the Red Army completes its build-up. Millions of men, tens of thousands of tanks, and mountains of artillery shells are massed along the river. A coiled spring ready to release devastation. Volkov stands on the turret, looking west into the grey mist, feeling the vibrations of the massive logistical machine behind him. The backbone of the Wehrmacht has been broken in the east, but its head still snaps and bites in Berlin. The time for the final hunt is approaching. April 16th, 1945. The Oderbruck floodplain, east of the Silo Heights. It is 3 o'clock in the morning, yet the darkness is absolute. A heavy, suffocating blanket that hides the largest concentration of artillery ever assembled in the history of warfare. Sergeant Alexei Volkov sits in the commander's cupola, the cold metal pressing against his spine, listening to the nervous breathing of his crew over the intercom. Around them, packed track to track in the muddy fields, are thousands of Soviet tanks, their engines silent, their crews waiting for the signal that will unleash the final storm. The air tastes of damp earth and unburnt diesel, but beneath it lies the metallic tang of impending violence, a tension so thick it feels like it could snap the steel hull of the T-34. Marshal Zhukov has devised a plan of terrifying audacity to blind the defenders and illuminate the battlefield. A masterstroke that relies on brute force and psychological terror. Along the entire front, 140 massive anti-aircraft searchlights are positioned at intervals, currently doused, waiting to turn night into day. Volkov checks his watch, the radium dial glowing faintly in the gloom, counting down the seconds until the world ends. He knows that up on the ridge, the German Ninth Army is waiting, dug into deep bunkers, desperate men with nothing left to lose but their lives. At 0300 hours precisely, the sky is torn apart. 40,000 artillery pieces and mortars open fire simultaneously, a sound so loud it ceases to be noise and becomes a physical pressure wave that compresses the chest and ruptures eardrums. The ground beneath the tank bounces like a trampoline, vibrating with such intensity that Volkov has to grip the hatch rim to keep from being thrown around. For 20 minutes, the horizon ahead is a continuous, convulsing wall of fire as millions of shells hammer the German positions, churning the earth into a roiling sea of explosions. Then, the signal flares climb into the sky, and the searchlights snap on, beams of blinding white light, totaling billions of candle power. stab into the darkness, aimed directly at the German lines. Driver. Forward! Full speed! Volkov screams. Though he can barely hear his own voice over the din, Sokolov engages the clutch, and the T-34 lurches forward, joining the massive steel avalanche rolling toward the ridge. The intent is to dazzle the enemy, to freeze them like deer in headlights. But the reality of war immediately intervenes with chaotic cruelty. The massive artillery bombardment has kicked up a cloud of dust and smoke so thick that the searchlight beams cannot penetrate it. Instead, the light reflects back off the wall of debris, creating a blinding, milky fog that dazzles the Soviet drivers more than the German gunners. Sokolov curses violently, wrestling with the steering levers, as he is forced to drive almost entirely blind into the glowing haze. The Oderbruch, a swampy floodplain reclaimed for farming, has been churned back into a quagmire by the shelling, and the heavy tanks begin to slide and drift in the thick, sucking mud. As they struggle through the marsh, the German response begins, proving that the enemy is far from destroyed. General Heinrici, anticipating the barrage, had withdrawn his troops from the front-line trenches just hours before the attack, leaving the Soviet artillery to pulverize empty earth. Now, the Germans are back in their firing positions on the heights, looking down at the illuminated Soviet tanks silhouetted perfectly against the searchlights. The darkness erupts with the flat, high-velocity cracks of 88mm flak guns firing in anti-tank rolls. The lead tanks of the assault wave begin to explode, their turrets cartwheeling into the air as they are hammered by plunging fire from the ridge. The advance slows to a crawl as the narrow roads through the swamp become choked with burning wrecks, forcing the following units to veer off into the minefields on either side. Volkov watches in horror as a T-34 to his right detonates, the ammunition cooking off in a tower of sparks, blocking their path. Left go left around the wreck, he orders, guiding Sokolov through a gap barely wide enough for the hull. They reach the foot of the silo heights, a steep escarpment that rises like a fortress wall out of the floodplain. The incline is steep, the ground slick with mud and oil, making the ascent a nightmare for the engines. Infantrymen, the tankodesantniki riding on the back of the tank, cling to the handrails as bullets spark off the armor like angry fireflies. Volkov buttons up the hatch, sealing himself inside the turret as the air outside fills with shrapnel and mortar bursts. The noise inside is a deafening cacophony of gears grinding and debris hammering against the steel plates. The T-34 claws its way up the slope, the engine screaming at redline, the tracks spinning for grip on the loose soil. Suddenly, a violent sledgehammer blow strikes the glacis plate, ringing the tank like a giant church bell and throwing the crew against their restraints. Sparks shower the interior, and the smell of ozone fills the compartment. Report damage, report, Volkov yells, his ears ringing. They have been hit by a solid shot, but the sloped armor has done its job. The shell ricocheted, leaving a deep gouge but failing to penetrate. We are still moving, gun is operational, Mikhail shouts back, his eye pressed to the sight. He spots the muzzle flash of a hidden PaK-40 anti-tank gun dug into a root cellar halfway up the ridge. The German gunners are reloading, their frantic movements visible through the optic. Mikhail traverses the turret, the electric motor whining, and fires a high-explosive shell into the bunker. The explosion collapses the structure, burying the gun and its crew under tons of earth and timber, clearing the path forward for a few more meters. The battle degenerates into a chaotic, close-range slaughter as thousands of tanks jam together in the narrow corridors leading up the heights. Marshal Zhukov, furious at the stalled advance, orders his reserve tank armies into the fray immediately, compounding the traffic jam. It is a mass of steel pressing against a wall of fire, a brute-force grinding match where strategy has been replaced by attrition. Volkov's tank is buffeted by the blast of friendly artillery falling dangerously close, the coordination breaking down in the confusion. By nightfall on the first day, they have barely advanced a kilometer, and the field behind them is a burning graveyard of Soviet armor. The crew is exhausted, their bodies bruised and battered, their eardrums shattered by the constant concussion. They dare not sleep, for the German tank hunter teams armed with Panzerfausts are prowling the darkness, looking for easy prey. Volkov keeps the hatch cracked open just enough to listen, his hand gripping a submachine gun, watching the shadows dance in the light of the burning village on the crest. The battle for the heights rages for 3 days. A relentless, grinding push that costs the Red Army tens of thousands of lives. It is a brawl fought with flamethrowers, grenades, and bayonets in the trench lines, while the tanks provide direct fire support at point-blank range. Finally, on the morning of April 19th, the German line cracks. The sheer weight of numbers and the endless pounding of the artillery eventually overwhelm the defenders, who begin to break and retreat toward the capital. The T-34 crests the top of the plateau, rolling past the shattered remains of the German defences. The scene is one of absolute devastation. The landscape has been chewed up so thoroughly that it resembles the surface of a dead planet. But as they clear the smoke of the burning ridge, Volkov sees it for the first time, the prize they have bled for over 2,000 kilometers. In the distance, some 70 kilometers to the west, lies a massive, sprawling city shrouded in a haze of smoke and dust. It is Berlin. The lair of the beast is finally within sight, its spires and domes visible against the grey horizon. The crew falls silent, the exhaustion momentarily forgotten as the realization hits them. The road from Stalingrad has been long and paved with the bodies of their friends. But the end is now tangible. Volkov looks at the city through his binoculars, his expression hardening. The open fields are behind them now. Ahead lies the concrete jungle of the city, the final fortress where the war must be finished. Street by bloody street, April 24th, 1945. The Lichtenberg district, eastern suburbs of Berlin. The horizon is no longer defined by the curve of the earth or the line of a forest, but by the jagged, broken teeth of a burning metropolis. Sergeant Alexei Volkov keeps his head low inside the cupola, peering through the cracked vision block at a landscape that defies comprehension. The once great capital of the Third Reich has been reduced to a claustrophobic maze of grey rubble, twisted tram lines, and hollowed-out apartment blocks that loom over the streets like canyon walls. The air is thick with a unique, choking dust, a mixture of pulverized brick, ancient mortar, and the sweet, sickly stench of unburied death that coats the back of the throat and refuses to wash away. The T-34-85, designed for the open steppes of Russia, where its speed and slope were king, is now a clumsy giant trapped in a cage of concrete. To survive the urban nightmare, the crew has welded, scavenged bed springs and wire mesh to the sides of the turret and hull. A desperate, improvised armor designed to pre-detonate the shaped charges of German Panzerfausts. These Faustniks, often roving bands of Hitler Youth or old men from the Volkssturm, lurk in the cellars and sewer grates, capable of turning the tank into a fiery coffin with a single shot. The threat is no longer 2 kilometers away. It is 10 meters away, hiding behind a pile of debris or inside a darkened window. Volkov communicates with the infantry squad, moving cautiously alongside them. A symbiotic relationship that is the only thing keeping them alive. The soldiers, their uniforms caked in white dust, use the tank as a mobile shield, spraying submachine gun fire into suspicious windows to suppress enemy tank hunters. In return, they act as the tank's eyes, spotting targets that Volkov cannot see through the limited vision slits. The advance is agonizingly slow, measured not in miles per hour but in houses captured per day. Every intersection is a potential kill zone, sighted by pre-positioned artillery or blocked by barricades made of overturned streetcars and rubble. Approaching the Frankfurter alley, the tank shudders as the tracks crush a barricade of furniture and paving stones, the engine growling in the confined acoustic space of the street. Suddenly, a streak of white smoke erupts from a basement window to the left, the telltale signature of a Panzerfaust launch. The warhead strikes the wire mesh screen on the turret side, detonating prematurely with a deafening crack that sprays molten copper and shrapnel harmlessly against the thick armor. Sokolov screams in surprise as the explosion rocks the hull, but the improvised defense has saved them from incineration. High explosive cellar. Left side, Volkov bellows, his heart hammering against his ribs as he traverses the turret toward the source of the attack. Mikhail spins the handwheels, sweat dripping from his nose, and fires a shell directly into the foundation of the building. The 85mm round explodes inside the basement, bringing the entire facade of the three-story shop collapsing into the street in a cloud of choking grey dust. There is no time to check for survivors or consider the morality of the destruction. In this concrete jungle, hesitation is a death sentence. The fighting evolves into a surreal, vertical warfare where danger comes from above as often as it comes from the ground level. Snipers positioned on rooftops fire down into the open hatches of tanks, forcing the crews to remain buttoned up in the suffocating heat. Volkov watches as a neighboring tank is hit from a third-story balcony, the Panzerfaust warhead punching through the thin top armor of the engine deck. The vehicle immediately catches fire, the crew bailing out into a hail of machine gun fire. A grim reminder that in the city, there is no front line and no safe rear area. As they push deeper toward the city center, the resistance becomes more fanatical and increasingly desperate. They are not fighting regular Wehrmacht units anymore, but a chaotic mix of SS diehards, foreign volunteers, and terrified children conscripted into the defense of a dying regime. At a frantic intersection near a metro station, Volkov spots a figure rising from a foxhole with a weapon, a boy, no older than 12, wearing a helmet that swallows his head. It is a moment of horrific hesitation, a fracture in the soldier's hardened soul. But the logic of survival overrides all else. Volkov gives the order to the Koch's machine gunner, and a burst of fire cuts the child down before he can trigger his weapon. The boy crumples back into the hole, a victim of a war started before he was born, and a silence descends inside the tank that is heavier than the armor plate. There is no glory here, only a grim, industrial process of extermination required to end the madness. The crew does not speak of it, they simply reload and check the temperature gauges, their humanity compartmentalized and locked away in a dark corner of their minds until the fighting stops. Nightfall brings no respite, only a shift in the lighting from grey daylight to the flickering, hellish orange of 1,000 fires. The city burns uncontrollably, the flames casting long, dancing shadows that make every pile of rubble look like a lurking tiger tank. They park the T-34 inside the lobby of a shattered department store, hiding from the flares and the roving searchlights of the massive flak towers that still dominate the skyline. The concrete giants, impervious to standard artillery, fire their heavy anti-aircraft guns horizontally into the Soviet formations, tearing entire blocks apart. Inside the department store, amidst shattered mannequins that look disturbingly like corpses, the crew attempts to rest while the infantry stands guard. They eat cold, tinned beef and drink water that tastes of rust, their faces blackened with soot and oil, looking like demons in the flickering firelight. The sound of the battle is constant, a relentless drumbeat of explosions and the ripping sound of MG 42 seconds echoing off the stone walls. They are physically exhausted, their hands shaking from the vibration of the engine and the adrenaline overdose. But sleep is a shallow, fitful thing haunted by the day's violence. Logistics in the ruined city is a nightmare of its own, with fuel and ammunition trucks struggling to navigate the debris-choked streets to reach the forward units. They scavenge what they can, siphoning diesel from disabled trucks and looting food from abandoned German cellars. Volkov finds a stash of preserved cherries in a basement, sharing the sweet, red fruit with his crew in a moment of bizarre contrast to the blood and dust outside. It is a small taste of life in a city devoted to death, a reminder that a world exists outside of the steel box they inhabit. On April 26th, the order comes to push toward the inner defensive ring, the S-Bahn railway line that encircles the government district. The resistance stiffens even further, with King Tigers parked in alleyways and 88mm guns firing down the long, straight avenues like bowling alleys. Every meter of ground is paid for in blood, forcing the Soviets to blast their way through the interior walls of connecting buildings rather than risk the open streets. This mouse-holing tactic protects the infantry but leaves the tanks exposed as they inch forward to provide fire support against fortified bunkers. They reach the Landwehr Canal, a murky, debris-filled waterway that serves as the final moat before the citadel of the Third Reich. The bridges are blown or heavily defended, and the water reflects the burning sky like a mirror of hell. Volkov looks across the canal through his periscope, seeing the dark, hulking shape of the Reichstag building in the distance, barely 2 kilometers away. It stands scarred and battered, a symbol of the enemy's power now within the grasp of their guns. The realization that the end is truly near acts as a stimulant, sharpening their dulled senses for the final push. They have traveled from the frozen banks of the Volga to the burning heart of Berlin, surviving insurmountable odds and witnessing the collapse of a civilization. But the final 2 kilometers will be the hardest of the entire war, a gauntlet of fanatical resistance where the enemy has nowhere left to retreat. Volkov checks the breech of the main gun one last time, ensuring a shell is seated. "Check your ammo," Volkov says quietly over the intercom, his voice raspy from the dust. "We cross the Spree tomorrow, and then we go home." The crew nods in the dim light of the instrument panel, tightening their grip on their controls. The beast is cornered, thrashing in its death throes, and they are the ones appointed to deliver the final blow. The engine rumbles to life, a deep, steady heartbeat of steel ready to carry them into the center of the fire. April 30th, 1945. The Moltke Bridge. Spanning the Spree River, the massive, smoke-blackened silhouette of the Reichstag building looms less than 600 yards away, a broken stone giant shrouded in the grey fog of war. Sergeant Alexei Volkov grips the commander's hatch rim with white-knuckled intensity, staring across the iron bridge that is choked with burning trams and debris. The air is vibrating, not just with sound, but with the sheer pressure of thousands of artillery shells hammering the diplomatic quarter. This is the final threshold, the last few hundred meters of a journey that began in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, and every inch of it is covered by German crossfire. The bridge itself is a death trap, rigged with explosives that failed to detonate fully, leaving it damaged but passable for the heavy armor. Sokolov revs the engine, the V2 diesel roaring a challenge to the German gunners hiding in the windows of the Ministry of the Interior on the opposite bank. They are not alone. A column of T-34 seconds and heavy IS-2 tanks is lining up behind them, engines idling like a gathering storm. Volkov gives the order, and the tank lurches forward onto the bridge, the tracks grinding over the cobblestones and the crushed remains of the barricades. Immediately, the tank is hammered by a storm of machine gun fire and high-explosive rounds that spark uselessly off the sloped frontal armor. The sound inside the turret is a continuous, deafening clangor, like being inside a bell struck by a sledgehammer. Mikhail traverses the turret toward the Kroll Opera House on the left, where muzzle flashes betray the position of a German 20mm anti-aircraft gun firing horizontally. He fires a high-explosive shell that smashes into the Opera House facade, silencing the gun in a shower of ornate masonry and dust. They clear the bridge and spill out into the Königsplatz, the vast, open square that sits like a sacrificial altar before the steps of the Reichstag. The ground here has been churned into a moonscape of water-filled craters and mud by the relentless Soviet artillery barrage. It is a killing field, utterly devoid of cover, swept by fire from the Zoo Flak Tower and the desperate defenders dug into trenches around the building. Sokolov zigzags the tank through the craters, the hull bottoming out with bone-jarring impacts that threaten to knock the crew unconscious. Directly ahead, a terrifying threat emerges from the gloom. An 88mm flak gun, dug into a flower bed, lowers its long barrel to point directly at them. Volkov screams a warning, but before Mikhail can adjust his aim, the German gun fires. The shell screams past their turret, missing by inches, the shockwave sucking the air out of the open hatch and leaving Volkov gasping. It is a duel of seconds. The German loaders are frantic, shoving another shell into the breach, while Mikhail fights the controls to bring his own gun to bear. "Fire! Fire now!" Volkov yells, his voice cracking with the strain. Mikhail squeezes the trigger, and the T-34 bucks violently as the 85mm gun spits flame. The shot is true, striking the shield of the German gun and detonating the ammunition piled nearby. A massive fireball engulfs the enemy position, throwing the gun crew into the air like ragdolls. There is no time to breathe. The infantry of the 150th Rifle Division are swarming past the tank, brown-coated figures rushing toward the steps of the Parliament building, screaming "Ura!" The T-34 advances slowly to support the assault, acting as a mobile pillbox to suppress the machine gun fire pouring from the bricked-up windows of the Reichstag. The building is a fortress, its walls meters thick, impervious to everything but the heaviest artillery. Volkov directs Mikhail to fire at the upper floors, trying to keep the heads of the defenders down while the Soviet sappers rush the main entrance with explosives. The air is so thick with smoke and dust that day has turned into a premature twilight, illuminated only by the tracers and explosions. Inside the tank, the atmosphere is a cocktail of exhaustion, adrenaline, and the suffocating heat of the main gun. Yuri, the loader, is moving on pure muscle memory, his uniform soaked through with sweat, his hands slippery on the brass shell casings. They have fired more rounds in the last hour than they did in the entire month of March. The floor of the fighting compartment is ankle-deep in spent casings, clattering around their boots as the tank maneuvers. They are part of a machine that cannot stop, driven by the collective will of a nation demanding vengeance. As night falls on April 30th, the red banner of victory is spotted on the roof of the Reichstag, a silhouette against the burning sky. Though the fighting continues in the basement, Volkov watches it through his binoculars, a lump forming in his throat that has nothing to do with the dust. It is the symbol they have chased for 3 years, through the snow of Russia, the marshes of Belarus, and the plains of Poland. But the war is not over yet. Fanatical SS units are still attempting to break out of the encirclement, launching suicidal counterattacks against the Soviet lines. For 2 more days, the crew lives inside the tank, sleeping in shifts while parked in the shadow of the conquered building. They fight sporadic engagements against snipers and roving bands of desperate German soldiers armed with panzerfausts. The city is dying around them, the once grand architecture reduced to skeletons of steel and stone. The noise of battle slowly begins to taper off, replaced by the crackle of fires and the distant rumble of collapsing walls. The frenzy of the assault gives way to a tense, watchful standoff. Then, on the morning of May 2nd, a strange and unfamiliar sound washes over the Königsplatz silence. The artillery stops. The machine guns fall silent. The order comes over the radio, transmitted in the clear General Weidling, the commander of the Berlin defense area, has ordered an unconditional surrender. Volkov pulls off his headset, his ears ringing in the sudden quiet. Hardly daring to believe what he is hearing, he looks at Sokolov, whose face is a mask of grime and disbelief, and slowly nods. "Engine off," Volkov says softly, his voice sounding incredibly loud in the stillness. Sokolov kills the V2 diesel engine, and the vibration that has been their constant companion for years finally ceases. The silence that follows is heavy, profound, and almost spiritual. They climb out of the hatches, their legs stiff and trembling, and stand on the engine deck. The air is cool and smells of wet ash, but the acrid sting of cordite is beginning to fade. From the ruins of the Reichstag and the surrounding cellars, the German defenders begin to emerge. They are not the Aryan supermen of the propaganda posters. They are broken, starving men, covered in bandages and dust, their eyes hollow with defeat. They walk past the T-34 with their hands raised, casting fearful glances at the Soviet tank crew. Volkov feels no surge of triumph, no desire to shoot them. The rage that fueled him at Stalingrad and Kursk has burned itself out, leaving only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a profound sense of relief. Volkov jumps down from the tank and walks around to the front, inspecting the machine that has carried them this far. The T-34 is a wreck, its fenders are torn off, the paint is scorched and peeled, and the armor is gouged with deep scars from shrapnel and ricochets. It looks like an ancient beast, battered and scarred, but still standing. He runs a hand over the cold steel of the glacis plate, tracing the weld line where the armor saved their lives back at Silo. This metal box has been their home, their weapon, and their savior. The rest of the crew joins him, standing in the mud of the Königsplatz, looking up at the red flag snapping in the wind atop the Reichstag. Yuri lights a cigarette with shaking hands, passing it to Mikhail. They think of the friends they left behind the burning tank at Prokhorovka, the infantrymen buried in the Polish mud, the faces that will never see this day. The victory belongs to them, but the cost is etched into their souls. They have survived the inferno, but they know a part of them will always remain in the fire. In the distance, a soldier begins to play an accordion, a melancholic Russian folk song that drifts across the square. Soldiers are embracing, weeping, firing their weapons into the air in celebration. But the crew of the T-34 stands quietly. They have traveled 2,000 kilometers through the heart of darkness to stand here. Volkov looks back toward the east, toward the motherland they defended, and then at the ruined city around him. The engine is cold, the gun is silent, the long journey is finally over.